Welcome, everyone. I'm Kara Stein. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Program at ACS. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on pathways to legal academia. As many of you know, over the years, ACS has hosted a number of conversations, a number of programs to inform our members about various aspects of working in the legal profession. But at the national level, we haven't focused as much as we might like on the academy, so we're hoping to change that. And this program is the first step in that direction. We're co-hosting it, we're happy to say, with ACS's Yale Law School student chapter. And if you're an ACS member who knows that becoming a law professor is your dream, or if you're just now starting to think that it might be, I hope you'll be in touch with us to let us know how we can help and what kind of information might be of use to you. I'll put my email in the chat box at one point, and you can be in touch with me or with my colleagues in our Department of Network Advancement, whom I know many of you work with often. If you are not already an ACS member, you should join us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Daniel Shackelford, who is a second-year student at Yale Law School and Vice President of Scholarship at ACS's Yale Law School student chapter. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Kara. I'm happy to be here. Hello, everyone. The YLS chapter of ACS is so excited to be partnering with ACS National, and it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists today. So first we have Kate Andrias, who is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Law, where she teaches and writes in the fields of constitutional law, labor law, and administrative law. She previously served as Special Assistant and Associate Counsel to the President of the United States and as Chief of Staff of the White House Counsel's Office. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Professor Andrias was an attorney in the political law and appellate litigation groups at Perkins Coie. She clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court and Honorable Stephen Reinhart of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Professor Andrias is a Yale Law School alum, where she served in the Yale Law Journal as a Coker Fellow, and prior to law school, she worked as a union organizer. Thanks so much for being here. Next, we have Ruben J. Garcia, who is Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Workplace Law Program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law. Prior to joining the UNLV faculty, he was a law professor and director of the Labor and Employment Law Program at California Western School of Law in San Diego, where he taught for 8 years. He also has held academic appointments at the University of California Davis School of Law, the University of Wisconsin Law School, and at the University of California, San Diego. Before beginning his teaching career, Garcia worked at Rothner, Siegel, and Greenstone as an attorney for public and private sector labor unions and employees in the Los Angeles area. He is a graduate of Stanford University, received his Juris Doctorate from UCLA School of Law, and has his LLM degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he was a William H. Hastie Fellow. He also served as co-president of the Society of American Law Teachers. It's great to have you here. And finally, we have Sharmila L. Murthy, who is an associate professor at Suffolk University Law School, where she teaches and writes on issues of property law, environmental law, international environmental law, poverty, and human rights. Previously, Professor Murthy was a visiting scholar at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she co-founded the Human Rights to Water and Sanitation program at the school's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. She began her legal career as a public interest poverty lawyer and was awarded a Skadden Fellowship to work with the Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee and the Cumberlands. Professor Murthy also litigated complex and class action cases as an associate with Leaf, Cabraser, Hyman, and Bernstein. She clerked for the Honorable Martha Craig Daughtry on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar in India. Professor Murthy received her JD from Harvard Law School, her MPA from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and her BS in Natural Resources from Cornell University. Thanks so much, all three of you, for joining us. We appreciate it so much. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to y'all, our panelists, to discuss your various pathways to academia. Each one of you has held a variety of positions throughout your careers, from clerking to working at firms to stints with the government. So my first question is, what ultimately made you choose teaching and writing in legal academia, and were there any roadblocks on the way that made you question your choice, and how did you overcome them? So Professor Andrias, if we could maybe start with you for this question and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to the Yale ACS chapter and National ACS for organizing this. It's terrific. So I got interested in academics, or potentially being an academic in college, and thought I would go on to do a PhD in history. In particular, I had a labor history professor and a women's history professor who were, really transformative in terms of my way of thinking about the world, and I got really interested in academic work through that. But I was also an activist, and I became really involved in union organizing also in college and community organizing. And so instead of pursuing that PhD in history, I went on to be a union organizer. Really from like the conviction that building a social movement is the best way to affect change. And I did that for a while. And then ultimately decided that law school would be a way for me to sort of merge my academic interests with my more activist, political, engaged interests. So I came into law school knowing that there was a good chance I might want to be a law professor, but not really having a great sense of how one might make that happen, not having any of my family or knowing any. And so really used law school to write lots of papers, work on the law journal, RA for professors, and kind of get a better understanding of what it would be like to be a law professor. But then again, kind of got pulled in back to sort of doing more activist engaged work, and kind of kept delaying becoming a law professor, clerking, working for a labor union, clerking again, going to work doing election law. And then when Obama won the election, I went into the White House. And so it became, so at a certain point, my mentors from law school said, if you want to be a law professor, you can't wait any longer. And so at that point, I applied for fellowships to go on the teaching market. So I think I was sort of always interested in it, but sort of torn between being an academic and being more of an activist and advocate.
Great, thanks so much. Professor Garcia, if you could speak next.
Sure, thanks so much for doing this, and it's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues to talk about this issue. I think it's so important that ACS is taking the lead on, and other organizations are taking the lead on building the next generation of law professors. So I think there's similarities between my story and Kate's. There were always questions about or interest that I had in sort of being at least an academic, and like Kate, not sure whether being a law professor was the right choice for me, but I was fortunate. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, and then went to college at Stanford, and I was fortunate to work with a law professor there on his research, a professor named Bill Hing, who's an immigration law professor. And so I got very interested in immigration law in college and policy issues in college. And I thought, that would be my practice area, or that I'd want to be an immigration lawyer. I went down to law school at UCLA, and the labor movement was budding and burgeoning at that time. Justice for Janitors was going strong. And I saw a lot of immigrant workers and civil rights coalitions in the LA area. And I got very interested in the intersections between immigration and labor at that time. And so I was just very glad to be able to be a labor lawyer. But I also had great mentors from law school and from college. Again, I think it's critical that we talk today about finding those mentors, because if it wasn't for certain faculty members at UCLA, Laura Gomez, Rick Abel, Kim Crenshaw, I would not be a law professor today. And like Kate, they were telling me, you really should think, if you're going to do this, you really should think about it soon. And so we're all going to talk about our different paths to academia. But I think many of us, and almost most of us probably today, are going through fellowship programs. And if it wasn't for Laura Gomez, my mentor, sort of telling me about different fellowship programs to apply to, like the Hasty Fellowship Program at Wisconsin, I would not be a law professor today. So I was, in terms of my journey, or in terms of my work at the time, being a union side labor lawyer, I can't imagine a better job. I know there are other areas of practice out there, but I still think it's the greatest area of practice in the world. And so like Kate's, my question was, do I want to continue being sort of more in the trenches, so to speak, or more closer to the ground than, quote, the ivory tower? And I think that, as we'll all talk about today, I think there are definitely ways to keep, foot on the ground in terms of this profession. And I think a lot of us do. But I think there was still the pull for me of just the opportunity to do a lot of writing and thinking about where the labor movement was going. And then, of course, the students are fantastic, and that's something that is really part of being a law professor that is really hard to find anywhere else. Being able to work with students and being able to try to impact the next generation of lawyers is a great privilege.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. We'll be sure to touch on the importance of mentors and fellowships later on. But Professor Murthy, could you share your path to academia?
Yes, thanks so much. And it's such a great honor to be on this panel, and I'm really happy to share my thoughts. And I had no idea that I was going to become an academic. When I was in law school, I really thought that I was just going to be a poverty lawyer or working overseas doing kind of international development work, and really I was at Harvard. I was at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau kind of before the kind of burgeoning of all the clinical programs. And so started my legal career after clerking as a Skadden Fellow, and was really kind of on that public interest path. And, it was kind of a series of events that wound up leading me to first do a little bit of class action work on the plaintiff side. And then when honestly, geography sometimes plays a role in what you're doing. And I wound up, for personal reasons, winding up in the Boston area, and realized at that point, my undergraduate was in natural resources. And I've always been so interested in this intersection of environmental law, poverty, human rights, both domestically and internationally. And I wound up kind of migrating back to the Harvard Kennedy School. So I had done dual degrees at the law school and the Kennedy School, wound up having an opportunity to start a program around the right to water. And honestly, was just having a lot of fun. I started writing. I had a chance to guest lecture and thought, wow, this is great. And I didn't honestly have really great mentors that were from the law school, because I kind of hadn't set myself up that way, and was very fortunate to go on the market, honestly, a little bit on a whim, and really wanted to stay in Boston for personal reasons. And and here it's really to the point of sort of mentors, and in some ways it is an insider's game. I mean, I had a philosopher and an ecologist writing my letters of recommendation from the Kennedy School. And, I felt very fortunate to get hired in the city that I wanted to be in, without necessarily the kind of tried and true credentials. But luckily I had been writing and had publications and had some other things that worked for me. But I think it's great for all of you who are here right now. You were sort of learning the things that honestly I really wasn't at all paying attention to in law school.
Great, thanks so much for those introductions. I want to continue with some specific questions, and definitely leave time at the end for everyone watching to ask questions. So if you're thinking about a question, be sure to put in the chat and we'll make sure it gets answered. But in terms of more specific questions that a lot of us are thinking about going to academia, is that we know that a lot of you on the panel are doctrinal professors, but we have a lot of experience in clinics, and there are clinical professors. So I'm wondering if we could start maybe differentiating the types of professorships and maybe the qualities that make one good for each, or if they're merging in particular ways. And maybe Professor Garcia, if you could mind taking the first go at this question.
Sure. So as I said, there's a diversity of paths to academia, but there's also a diversity of destinations. And again, for many of us, the idea was to be, replicate that first year experience of like teaching a doctrinal course like constitutional law, as I do, or other, contracts towards those kinds of, and then also having a specialty area. And I think that's, for most people, that's the idea of being a law professor, but it's really not the only way. And I think more and more we see faculties, a diversity of faculty in terms of different sections of the law. So for example, legal writing is becoming a discipline, and has been actually a discipline in terms of scholarship for a long time. And that has been recognized, I think, by a lot of law schools in terms of putting both legal writing and clinical faculty, as they are at our school, on a unitary tenure track, right? So that is, again, I think a function of the fact that more clinicians have been doing scholarship for a long time, but more and more it's becoming an expectation for clinicians, and it's becoming the same with legal writing faculty as well. But I think that the common denominator, of course, for most of this, as we'll talk about, is writing, right? And so that's really sort of the coin of the realm for most, entry into most jobs in the academy today. So we can talk about different strategies in terms of doing that, but the bottom line is, in terms of tenure track hiring or long-term contract hiring, some expectation of writing is going to be expected.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks for sharing. Any other panelists want to weigh in on this question and different types of professorships?
No, except I would just agree with what Ruben said, that I think at least at Suffolk, we now have tenure track clinical, tenure track legal writing, and I think that seems to be more and more the norm. And so there are many, many different paths into academia.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think a lot of us at ACS in particular come to law school and maybe with academia with a lot of strongly held political beliefs with a sense to really make an impact in the world. And so my next question is, to what extent does maybe a desire to be political or an activist preclude or maybe help going into academia as professor? And Professor Andrias, I wonder if you could start us off on this question.
I think there are a lot of different kinds of academics who understand their role differently. So I don't think there's any, one answer to that question. For me, one of the things I most love about being an academic is the freedom that it gives you to really engage with the problems that you care about and engage with them on multiple levels, and in teaching students about them and engaging with students about them, to write about them and think about them from a theoretical or policy reform perspective, and also to be engaged on the ground with sort of ongoing pro bono projects. So I feel like one of the reasons that being a professor has been such a terrific choice for me is that it has enabled me to continue being engaged with the problems that I deeply care about, and being, the issues facing workers, problems of inequality, problems of democracy, and I have found that to be a real source of ideas for writing. So it's been helpful to my, to my academic work to be engaged in problems I care about. That said, I think that the enterprise of being an academic and of writing a successful paper is a little bit different from writing something that's really an advocacy piece. And so part of the process of becoming acculturated to legal academia is kind of being able to sort of wear different hats and also kind of understand how you can do academic work that is advancing your deeply held beliefs, but isn't the same thing as, writing a brief or writing a white paper or doing advocacy work. So sort of engaging second order questions and about the work. Certainly there's lots of academics who don't see themselves as activists, but I think there's a real space for people who want to try to reshape the law and who have deeply held views about what law should be and what justice looks like to be law professors. And it's a terrific job for people who have those commitments. I would just add one thing. We've talked about mentors before, but one of the things that was really helpful for me is I had several mentors who encouraged me to pursue the questions I really cared about. And that was really transformative at an important time. So I remember being on the job talk and just on the job market and being, not terribly enthused about my job talk paper and sort of not knowing whether I was really going to feel satisfied and fulfilled as an academic, and having a conversation with one mentor who just really encouraged me to write about things I deeply cared about. And that was, and my research agenda shifted as a result of that conversation. And that has been that's been really important for me.
Great, thanks so much. I do want to say I see the questions coming in and I love it. And so keep them coming and be sure to get to them. But if we could continue on a little bit on maybe the importance of mentors, I mean, I think that's really important when we go into academia. Maybe Professor Garcia, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, and I just wanted to agree entirely with what Kate said. I think that the issue here, if you're going to be spending a lot of time in a room by yourself writing, it should be something you care deeply about, right? And that's pretty much what most of the job of a law professor is, spending a lot of time, again, as law students know, classes 2 hours a week, and that's or 4 hours a week, and that's great. But it is, most of the rest of the time is spent writing articles that hopefully you have a passion about. And so that's, I think that's good advice for everyone here. And again, in terms of mentors and also organizations, right? So there are a lot of organizations that can play a pivotal role in terms of both your own sort of professional development and also, of course, your, the kind of network that you'll need to get a job in teaching, right? And so the ACS to begin with, right, is an amazing network for professors and attorneys, and so I think that is, that's why I said this conversation is so great to have under ACS's umbrella. But other organizations like SALT, the Society of American Law Teachers, which I was president of a few years ago, is also always doing development. In fact, I think they're doing something this week or even now in terms of the job market, and they have, along with LAT-CRIT, they have done a annual faculty development workshop that is intended to both prepare candidates for the market, but also to diversify the market, and that is, of course, again a critical need that we have when we talk about sort of why we're doing this. It's because, as you might have seen in your law schools or in the demographic data, there's a dearth of diversity, not only of racial minorities, but also really progressives. I think if we're really going to come down to it, that and that's why I think it's important again for ACS to be having this role in terms of building the next generation of progressive law faculty.
So I could jump in and say that although I did not I was not thinking about academia when I was a law student, and so perhaps was differently situated than Kate and Ruben, I did actually use the ACS network when I was on the market. And I reached out to people that I knew because I had been involved with the lawyer chapters, and so knew some professors through that. And I remembered getting some very, very useful advice. And someone I remember, Bill Marshall, I remember, who's been a long time member of the ACS board. I remember reaching out to him, and it was after I had submitted my form, and he was like, "Who advised you on this form?" And I was like, "Nobody." And he was like, "Why didn't you talk to me before? You should have listed XYZ on the form in a particular way." So I highly recommend using the ACS network, because people are willing to give you advice. And this is more like do what I didn't do and get the advice before you actually go on the market.
Thanks so much. Speaking of advice, if we could continue, the importance of fellowships. It's actually a question that has come up a while. I know, Sharmila, you did a SCAD fellowship. Garcia, you were a Hastings fellow. But if we could talk about the importance of fellowships. One question asked was, is it better to do a fellowship program or a VAP, which I'm assuming is a visiting assisting professorship? But maybe Professor Murphy, if you could start with that.
Sure. So a SCAD fellowship is not at all going to prepare you for being an academic, right? It's basically it's a 2-year fellowship that allows you to propose a project to work at a nonprofit group, usually doing poverty-oriented work. And I wound up creating my own, because I wasn't sure that I was going to become an academic, I wound up sort of creating my own fellowship at the Kennedy School. But I think that the reason people go through fellowships now is because it gives folks an opportunity to actually have mentorship. So if you haven't been mentored before, you're going to be in a program, you get mentorship, you're in a group of people where you are workshopping your papers. A lot of fellows also get teaching practice. So for example, you may be helping with teach legal writing or something else. And I suppose, I'm not that well qualified to talk about the difference between a VAP and a fellowship, except to say that if a VAP is giving you teaching experience, my experience sitting on faculty meetings when we are looking at hiring is that people that come in tested with some teaching experience and with some student reviews, they are seen more favorably because you're not brand new. You seem like you have a little bit of experience under your belt.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Professor Andrias?
So I would just add to that, it's not always clear that there's a difference between a fellowship and a VAP. Sometimes the difference is really just the name. So I think the things to think about, fellowships can be extremely helpful, particularly if you're in a busy job. It's very hard to write a long paper. And in order to go on the teaching market, certainly on the doctrinal side, but increasingly on the legal writing and clinical side, you need to have a published or soon to be published or will be publishable paper as your job talk. And to do that while you're working a full-time job or a double-time job, as many legal jobs are, or in my case, I also had children, it's near impossible. So, so having a fellowship gives you the space to write. They can be called VAPs and they can be called fellowships. I think the things to think about are things like, I mean, there's always a personal consideration of geography, but is the fellowship going to give you the opportunity to develop a new set of mentors, as Professor Murthy said? Is it going to give you exposure to the academic work of the institution? Are you invited to job talks? Are you invited to legal theory workshops at the institution? Is it going to give you an opportunity to teach, but also not teach so much that you don't have time to write? Or is it going to give you like a substantive focus that you're interested in? So there's some fellowships that are more focused on one substantive area. And there's just a lot of really good fellowships out there. And sometimes you have to cast a wide net. But for me, it was essential. I don't think there's any way I could have written a paper without a fellowship.
Yeah, I have to agree again and say that things have developed, or things change, of course, from year to year. When I was a PhD fellow, it was, there were different fellowships available. That was 2000 to 2002. But now there's, the Hastie Fellow is still there. The Hastie Fellowship at Wisconsin, again, which is, and some of them are intended or have been intended for years to kind of diversify the legal profession, the legal academia. But there are also, of course, at different schools, fellowships that also include a sort of a legal writing component, like the Bigelow Fellow or the Columbia Associates in Law program. Those are really good. But, some fellowships like the Hastie Fellowship don't expect that, or they don't expect, teaching as well. So there's a plus and minus to that, as Shamila was saying, in terms of having some experience teaching, is always, a good plus. But you, of course, I think these fellowships know that the more important thing is to have, the writing done, and that's why they do that.
Great. Now, before we open it up to everyone else's questions, which are coming in, I want to end with what resources are out there for folks for pursuing a career in academia. And maybe Professor Garcia, I know you served as the co-president of SALT. If you can mind telling us a little bit about their Breaking In program or other resources. Please feel free.
Sure. And again, it's evolving now because a lot of it is online, so it's even probably more available than it has been for years. We used to have Breaking In programs in different cities, not just into sort of doctrinal faculty positions, but also legal writing and clinical faculty positions. Focusing on those things that might make one competitive for those positions. We have put out materials, or as I said, the SALT Lat Crit Faculty Development Workshop is an annual event and is now many of those programs are now available online. So that is saltlaw.org is a good place to find a lot of those resources. And I think also in terms of online resources, there are moderated, or I should say sort of updated lists of fellowships that are available. I think so if you're interested in being a legal academic, then you spend a lot of time surfing probably to Brian Leiter's blog, or to the Faculty Lounge, or to Prof's blog, or to Tax Prof blog. And there's a lot of, you just start learning more about legal education and how it works. And they usually have helpful, not only sort of job openings and who's on different hiring committees, but also helpful lists of what fellowships are available. And to go back to the earlier question, sometimes there's an advertised fellowship, and sometimes a law school, perhaps in your area or where you live, may be willing to create some kind of a visiting assistant professor position. And so that's why it's always important to keep connected to your alma mater and what their resources are, but B, also to connect yourself with the law school in your local law schools in your local area, and particularly their associate deans for academic affairs, because they're the ones who also hire adjuncts. So we can talk about adjunct teaching as a strategy, but they're the ones to really make those decisions.
I would just add to that I know Michigan has a program for our own students and for our alums where we support people who want to go on the teaching market, clinical, legal writing, or doctrinal. And we have a committee who's there to help you, with your review your CV, your form that Shamila was talking about that has to go in, to the ALS conference, your drafts of your job talk papers, to make sure that you have recommenders, and then also to moot you, like to do sort of practice job talks. And I know for me, Yale had something very similar where I went and I attended multiple years of this moot camp, which was really helpful to watch other people sort of preparing to go through the market to get a sense of what it was. So I think many of your law schools probably already have those programs, and if they don't, I think it's a fair thing to ask of your professors and your law school to give you that support. And then ACS also offers support. There's a terrific organization run by Guy Charles and others called CULP, for Emerging Scholars of Color. So there's a lot of resources out there, and I think really making use of all of them and not being shy about asking for help is essential.
Great, thanks so much. So we can get on to the audience questions, and a couple of questions are related. Is it wise to get an additional degree, and can a PhD be helpful in legal academia? It seems to be like a trending path. Does anyone want to take a stab at this question?
I can start. I think it is increasingly the case that many people going on the entry-level teaching market have PhDs, and that can be helpful for a number of reasons. Like a fellowship, it gives you the space to write and to write deeply about a particular issue. It also means that you can bring to bear the methodology of another discipline. We have, for example, among recent hires, we have PhDs in economics and philosophy and history, really runs the gamut. I think that it's not necessary. And it's also something that you should do only if you want to do the PhD and you really want to, you're passionate also about that other subject and about spending that much time with another, doing the work. And I also think it tends to be helpful when when your legal interests and your PhD interests really fit together. So what tends to be less helpful is like when it looks like, oh, you did a PhD, didn't get a job on that job market, and then switch, or where the two it's not clear how the two interests integrate at all. That can be less helpful. But it's certainly the trend that many people getting hired at the entry level have PhDs.
Great. We have a kind of realistic question. Is law review a prerequisite for becoming a professor?
Again, I would say that writing or experience doing law review articles is a prerequisite. And, again, to the extent that law review helps you get into that culture, I think it's a plus. But I don't see it as the minimum qualification or anything like writing law review articles is. I also wanted to say, just to go back to the previous question, I agree entirely with what Kate says. It's also, of course, for those, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about, and it should be clear that, people come from a lot of different schools, law schools, in terms of going into teaching. There's certainly that diversity. We know that there's statistically there's certain schools tend to feed into academia more than others. But if there are if people have concerns about whether or not they're competitive based on where they went to school, a PhD or a fellowship again could be very helpful for that. To have that extra plus for the job market. But again, there's a lot of people from a lot of different schools all throughout the academy.
Great. Another question we have is, assuming you have some contact with your colleagues at undergraduate institutions, what are the biggest differences between being a law school professor and being a college professor? And what are the strengths of being a law professor? Any other thoughts or insights on this question?
I guess one difference is that you're teaching students who are in professional school, not undergraduates, so they're older, but also that means that we generally don't have TAs doing the bulk of the teaching and grading, so that you really, the advantage of that is you really get to know your students. There's lots and lots of, close engagement with students. The disadvantage is you spend your entire winter break grading exams, so that's one big difference. Obviously another difference is, we're largely tuition funded, at least most law schools, and so that creates different sort of economic incentives than in some undergraduate institutions or in certain disciplines where there's more grant money available. But I think in the end, in some ways they're very similar jobs, because what you're doing a lot, you're teaching and you're writing. For me, what was really important about law school was the ability, in addition to teaching and writing, to also be engaged in real world problems. So I continue to write briefs and do policy work. And that's very different from, friends who are philosophers or English professors, maybe more similar to people who are in public policy schools or social science schools.
Great.
No, I was just going to say, I think it just as a practical matter, I don't know this for a fact, but I think probably entry-level law professor jobs might be slightly higher paid than entry-level, say, jobs in a typical liberal arts college. And so, sometimes people that really have a passion, and just, to the PhD point, we've also hired a number of people that are JD PhDs, but it also seems like, if you're going that fast, because you love the topic, and it's something that you're passionate about. It gives you that chance to write. Sometimes people do it while they're also working or doing something else, and it's just but I do think that I think we all feel like we're just lucky, that we have a job that just allows us to write and think and engage critically in the real world, but also work with students.
Great. We have another practical question. How many papers do you need to have published before going on the market or applying for a fellowship or VAP?
You didn't hear that it was 30? No, when I went on, there was, the FAR form, which was the one form, right, had 3 spaces from what you were, and the goal was to have something written in each of those 3 spaces. Now, I haven't looked at the FAR form recently, but that was sort of what I was told. Like, if you have 3, that's beautiful. But I think even if you have one really great paper that's really well placed, because the goal is, when you go in the job market, the sweet spot is that you have a paper that's been accepted somewhere but hasn't yet come out, so there's still room for improvement. You could take from the job talk, but it's not a done deal.
That's a really hard, oh, sorry, Ruben. I was just saying, that's a hard question to answer. I've also observed, I've been on our hiring committee, I think 4 times now, and I've observed that people are coming on the market with more and more writing, but I'm not sure that that's necessary. It's just more and more people are doing fellowships and coming on with PhDs, so they have a lot of publications. But in the end, so it's helpful to have more than one. It shows that you're productive. It shows that you have a lot of ideas. But I think having one really great paper that you go on with as your job talk paper, and then a clear research agenda is probably more important than a large volume of papers. But it's hard. I don't know that we have a lot of empirical evidence to answer that.
I was just going to say that exactly. I think as long as you have a talk, a paper, hopefully that is well placed, enough, and also that can still be molded by faculty, who will hopefully hire you. That's really the key. But as Sharmila said, also it's nice to have something in those 3 boxes, not just not just one thing, but something in each of those three boxes on the form.
Great. As a related follow-up question that just came in, are student notes considered in that? How are they considered? I imagine they'd be helpful somewhat to show that you have a passion for legal academia, but any thoughts on student notes contributing or just post-graduation academic articles?
And I think it goes back to the previous question in terms of how a student note, put it in one of those slots, great, and it does something, but it's more important to be sort of temporary in terms of where your future is going rather than what you did.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know all of you worked at firms at some point, and one of the questions we have is, do you have to work at Big Law to get a legal academia job?
Proof that no. So I worked at a union side labor law firm, and so for me, anyway, no, but others, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I did work briefly at Big Law, but I did, exclusively voting rights and election law while there. But I don't think I've ever been in, I don't think there's any requirement. It never comes up. And some faculties really want to know that you can be a lawyer and can teach law. So having some legal experience, even if it's summer jobs and a clerkship, but for some faculties, having additional legal experience is important. That's not true universally, but where it is, I don't think matters at all. And I don't think there's a particular advantage to Big Law. Maybe if what you really want to teach about it is mergers and acquisitions, having worked in M&A is important. Or, if what you really want to teach is labor law, having worked doing some labor work like Ruben did or like I did is helpful, but it's by no means a requirement. Writing is the requirement.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I never worked in Big Law and would agree with all of that.
Great. What advice do you have for an experienced attorney as opposed to a law student or someone only a few years out of law school who wants to make the jump to academia?
The answer is the same in terms of writing. It's have a lot of years practicing, as Kate was saying. That can be a plus, particularly for some schools. So really, again, it starts with the writing, and then it may be for someone like that some adjunct teaching is a good idea, or some kind of visiting, like I said, a VAP somewhere is a good idea. Still to start to show that you can still learn, because that's most of what we do, right? We spend a lot of time learning new things and have to transmit them to students. And so I think it's probably a goal then, or should be a goal to not expect that you can sort of walk in and after 20 years experience and know everything about torts or contracts or anything like that, because again, things change in that time. And of course, what we're really looking for is people who can adapt and learn new things and sort of bring that to the students.
I would just add that there's some positions at law schools that are really designed for people who are senior attorneys and to bring to bear to the law school all of their experience. So, for example, we have someone who's spent a lot of time as a U.S. attorney and has now joined the faculty. So there aren't the same, it's a different position, right? It's a senior attorney, senior scholar or senior attorney position. If you want to make the jump to sort of entry level teaching, an entry level doctrinal position, I think you just need to show that you are able to make the transition to being an academic, and that you're, and so again, writing in an academic voice as opposed to a practitioner voice is really important. And I think it can be hard I was out almost 10 years. I think that it can be harder if it's even, the longer it is to convince faculties that you want to be an academic. Right, and the best way to do that is through doing academic writing. But there's certainly plenty of examples of people who have practiced for quite a while and then made the switch.
Great. It seems like writing has been a consistent theme, and one of the questions we get is how much should we care about where the writing gets placed? Doesn't matter which ranking of the law journals that we're contributing to.
Yeah, I think it does, but maybe I could speak about this for a minute, because I think it's interesting to think about what you're, and here's where, even if you didn't do law review, understanding how that process works, and that it's actually, law students who are in the business of making the decisions. And given what I have found in my own work is that, a lot of students haven't taken international law or environmental law areas that I'm writing about. And so a lot of my work winds up in specialty journals, maybe at top schools, but specialty journals, whereas, I also teach property law. And I feel like if I actually was writing about property, I suspect that I would have more broader appeal to student editors. So I do think it's something to consider just as you're thinking about your research agenda, that the kind of more specialized you are, the perhaps less kind of mainstream you're writing on, you might wind up not kind of in sort of the mainstream journals. But I think, and I do think there is always a little bit of it, especially when you're first getting placed. It can be helped, for example. By the way, am I cutting in and out, because I think my connection may be unstable. I keep getting these announcements.
I can still hear you. I hope
Okay.
I think you're good.
Okay, but anyway, these are the product challenges with Zoom. But let me just stop there.
Is it remotely realistic for individuals who are not at top law schools to get into academia? And another question that says, I am not at a top law school. Would you recommend pursuing an LLM before going into the teaching market?
Am I back on? Because like Shamila, I had a little internet pickup there. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So the question, I think, goes back to what we were talking earlier about in terms of, there's a lot of diversity in terms of where people went to school. And I think that a lot of, law schools, in terms of what they're looking for, like we've been talking about, is just that interest in passion for teaching, and also that passion for scholarship that's shown through, law review articles. And I think, to go back just a little bit to the question before, it depends on where you want to teach, right? If you really are set, or maybe at the law school you really only have like a few law schools that you want to teach at geographically, perhaps, that's really going to, those law schools are going to have perhaps than a lot of other law schools sort of throughout the country. And so it's the same with law review placements, right? If you want to go to teach at a top 15 law school, then you should probably be trying to shoot for top 15 law review placements, right? But there's a lot of other opportunities besides that, right? And I think in terms of the LLM, it's similar to the question of the fellowship, right? If the fellowship gives you time to do the work, then great. It doesn't have to necessarily, result in an LLM. Of course, an LLM from a top 15 law school is also, a nice thing, depending, again, for several reasons, but not necessary as long as you have actually published and done the writing and have the, as Kate was saying, the research agenda that people are interested in hearing more about.
Great, thanks so much. If we could move to the importance of clerkships. We have one question that says, I'm a student at UVA and not a single professor I know hasn't clerked at the appellate level. I'm wondering what the current emphasis on clerking is.
I mean, I think all of this just points to the same theme, which is that, there are, when somebody's a law professor, they usually like being a law professor, and there often isn't a lot of turnover, right? So there's a few spots, and it is tied to, as Kate mentioned before, just the fact that when we are tuition dependent, and so when enrollment's down or schools decide to shrink, there's just less hiring. All of that is to say is that it's a competitive field, because all of you also want to be law professors. And so any little thing that you have to distinguish yourself, right? So whether it's a clerkship or whether it's an LLM or whether it's a fellowship. But so yes, of course, all of those things help, but there's no line. I mean, from my standpoint, I don't think there's any line drawn in the sand. It's just that any particular year, they're looking at what are what are our hiring needs? And I think maybe something that we haven't talked about that's actually very practical is schools have hiring needs. And what I have, as much as we are talking about writing and writing matters, what I have seen at least is that the need to teach certain required topics is what's driving the hiring. And so if they have a need to teach torts, you know, they're going to want folks that know how to teach torts and maybe have some connection in their writing to torts, but that have listed torts on their form as a as something to teach.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Another question is, what time is considered almost too late to enter academia? And how does the timing work? Is there a sweet spot to enter academia in your professional career?
Well, I got similar to the question earlier about if you've been a practitioner for a long time, you shouldn't consider, you know, academia as retirement. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, it's we have a lot of responsibilities besides teaching and writing, that, you know, just basically being part of the governance of an institution. And so that's, you know, it's definitely more than a full-time job. So that's definitely not the time to think about it, you know, as a career, you know, as a sort of a retirement from a long career of practice. But as we said earlier, you know, some years in practice can, you know, certainly help. You know, again, if you want to get into the norms of academia in terms of writing, that can be a plus. I think, you know, there are some people who go straight from a clerkship into teaching. I think, you know, maybe they also go straight from a PhD into teaching, right? But those who practice, I think the average, maybe empirically, has been like 4 or 5 years, just an average, right? You know, there could be more. You know, I was about 4 or 5 years out of law school when I went on the market. So that's all it is, really, an average. And I think you know, some years of practice maybe I think are helpful, but obviously, as we know from the experience of many others, not always required.
Great, thanks. Another question we have is, what would your recommendations be if you are currently struggling to find a mentor through the process?
Talk to Kara. No, seriously. I mean, the ACS, I mean, I think everyone on this panel would be happy to talk to you. But if you are involved with ACS at your law school, your faculty advisor there is a great start. And ACS, I mean, part of the goal of ACS, right, is to develop these networks across students, across lawyers, across law professors, but then through those networks. So if you really aren't finding a mentor at your own institution, I'm not kidding that I actually think you should just email Kara, who put her contact information out there anyway.
I think that's absolutely right. But I would also say, I know for me at law school, I found it hard to connect with professors in the very large classes. There just wasn't a lot of opportunity, and I wasn't, you know, I would sometimes like shy about participating a lot in those big classes. So for me, what was particularly helpful was working as an RA for professors. It was a way to both get a sense of their academic work and get to know them, and also writing seminar papers or writing independent papers supervised by professors, because then there's sort of a natural mentorship relationship that occurs through the process of writing, and then sort of looking out in other contexts for people who you know, either through ACS or other networks. But I think working with professors through the writing process, their own writing process and your own writing process, is a great way to develop mentorship, and mentorship on the kind of thing that you're actually going to do as an academic.
Great points. And as I said, I was really lucky to find mentors pretty early on. But I also look for, you know, mentors outside of, you know, the first year faculty that I had assigned. It's going to date me a little bit, and it's pretty nerdy, but, you know, I comb through the, you know, catalog when they used to have catalogs back in the 90s of, you know, all the professors and their biographies. I comb through that and look for people who I'd want to talk to about, you know, what I was interested in. And you know, I sought them out, and basically in terms of you know, what their interests were, you know, even if I didn't have them as professors, but also I knew, my second year of law school, that the classes I wanted to take were kind of writing classes, and the ones that, where I would get mentorship in my writing from people like Rick Abel and Kim Crenshaw, and that was, again, just incredibly fortunate and lucky. But at every law school, again, there are people who are not your professors who you should feel free to seek out, and if they have similar interests to yours.
Just one last thought on that. There's a number of, this hits both writing and mentorship. There are a number of opportunities to write on blogs that professors run, or that professors run with students, whether it's the LPE blog or whether it's the On Labor blog, or there's several corporate blogs, legal history blogs. So I think writing writing big academic pieces is ultimately what you need to do, but writing smaller things can be really helpful as well, and also can be another way to engage with a different set of professors.
Great, thanks so much. I do want to be conscious of everyone's time, but one student asked a broad question that I think we could end on. It's what's missing in legal academia? Do you think there are areas of improvements that can be made from within or with outside the institution of legal academia? What's missing? Oh, it's a tough one.
Well, I mean, I think the answer in some ways, legal academia is still extremely non-diverse, and it's a major problem. It's not diverse enough on the metrics of race at the sort of senior levels. It's still not diverse in terms of gender. It's not diverse in terms of sort of life experience. And so I think that most law schools have recognized this problem, and there is a will to change that, but that means also changing who's in the pipeline to becoming academics. That's, I think, the primary thing I would identify. I also think there's a pretty exciting new trend just in terms of sort of ACS's values, which is, for a long time, legal academia was somewhat dominated by law and economics, or certain kinds of thinking about law and its relationship to politics and its relationship to the economy. And there's sort of a growing movement of people both affiliated with ACS, with the LPE movement at Yale, and with various other institutions that are trying to bring in really important new ideas into areas, not necessarily just human rights, right? Not necessarily just labor, but into sort of all parts of the curriculum. So I think that's another thing that I see as exciting and missing historically.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, in terms of diversity, absolutely. And diversity, again, as I was saying earlier, of progressive and labor lawyers, human rights lawyers, kind of a diversity of experience. For example, rather than, and I think in these questions we've seen it. I mean, the feeling like you have to work at a big firm, for example, to be a law professor. That kind of question just comes from this idea that everyone, all my professors, work at a big firm. And so that therefore, if I want to be a law professor, I must have to do that as well. Right. And so that's what the importance of this program and ACS is, to show these different paths, but also, again, to change legal scholarship. I mean, I think that legal scholarship has become very, conservative because of the market, right? The market has, in order to get a job, many people feel like they have to write on corporate law because everyone's looking for corporate law, right? And so the topics that people choose are becoming more conservative because the number of jobs has shrunk from 2010, and who knows, where we're going from here. So that has had a conservative impact on scholarship that I hope, again, that ACS and the people in this call can change. And so that's why I'm so glad we're doing this.
Great, thanks so much to all of you for joining. I know personally I learned a bunch from this, and I encourage everyone watching to reach out to ACS National or your local chapter. And we just really want to appreciate, thanks so much for joining on this Friday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.